All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session under our Communication and Skills program. For those of you who don't know, as part of our programs at GMI, our diploma programs, one of the courses that we have is called Communication and Industry Skills, wherein we explore different aspects of communication, different channels of communication that a professional in the field of music can explore in today's times. We have had some very interesting conversations and sessions in the past wherein we have engaged with journalists such as Anurag Tagat. We had the duo from Humming Heart join in last week to share their inputs. We have had people from the social media coming in talking about how to use social media. We have had our very good friend Manognya come in and speak to us about negotiation and networking and a very integral part of communications. And for today, we have a very, very special guest, someone who's been associated with us personally for a very long period of time, but also with GMI, and over a period of time with GMI in different capacities, and being sharing with us his experiences through being a workshop where he came all the way down to the campus with his full band. Back in I think 18 or 19, back in those days when he was doing an India tour, to doing online workshops and some short programs with us while he was in US. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Shubh Saran here. And so happy, Shubh. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. Thank you for being here, everybody. This is nice.
Yeah, so in the audience today, we do have students who are enrolled as part of our program, but we also have some more people who are wanting to just be here and hear you share your stories because we made it a bit open session.
Nice.
So looking forward to having this conversation. I
Welcome.
think first and foremost, I don't think we need to go very back because we've had this conversation very many times. But let's talk specifically focusing on the last 2 years, which have been really different and I won't say difficult, but challenging in their own ways for people in their own rights, and how that had a bearing on you as a musician or as an artist. So maybe if you'd like to share something about that.
Yeah, definitely. Challenging is the right word. Hard, challenging, all those words. Yeah, it's for many reasons, obviously. Not having any work to do per se, and also just the state of like world and life that we live in, and the media we're consuming and stuff. For the past 2 years hasn't been you know great, especially
Yeah.
in as like creative fodder. It hasn't been the most like I don't know. Yeah, it just hasn't been the best environment to be creative, I think, in to a certain degree. So when things locked down, I started to write music because we all thought it would only last maybe a couple of weeks, and then obviously, as the weeks went on, we figured it was going to last a little longer. So I started writing music for this new album that I kind of had a concept of, but I didn't know what it was going to be about. This kind of deep dive into like identity and like how I see myself and like the aspects of my identity that like are fraught with a little tension and stuff. All those kind of things were a product of just staying home really and like thinking about things and writing music and reading and like kind of taking like really introspecting. Like I'm sure a lot of people here know, like being a musician, you are constantly inundated with many different things all the time. So like if you're a student, you're practicing and you're doing classes and you study. If you have a job and you're a musician on the side, you're in between a lot of worlds. And even if you're just a full-time musician, you're also either teaching or you're doing sessions and you're playing for other bands and other people. So the opportunity to just do nothing and just focus on your own writing for like 6, 7, 8 hours a day is a pretty unique thing that I could only really do in this pandemic. And so it spawned a lot of these ideas. One of them being this podcast, but yeah, the record kind of and everything was born out of just being home and immersing myself in things that I was interested in, that I had time for finally.
So the idea that what I understand is the album that recently came out, English. The theme was identity, as you have been speaking about it, and it's something that all of us, I think, at different points of time in our life, keep exploring and kind of keep, figuring that out for ourselves. What is it in our context? So, you definitely obviously found music as a form of expression, but when you went back into writing about this, did you also explore some other did you have either influences which had a bearing on when you went about writing this album for that,
Yeah,
on this
definitely.
topic, on this theme,
Yeah,
sorry?
100%. It was reading a lot. Like I started reading at the early part of the pandemic about like identity. I was reading some of the New York Times bestsellers at the time, which was like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram X. Kendi. They're writing about sort of like Black American culture and like their identity in the U.S. and in the world. And then from there, I started reading about sort of slightly more Indian related contexts, just so I could relate to myself a little bit more. It was extremely relatable, even just reading like American authors. But this one book that I read by Sunil Bhatia called Decolonizing Psychology was a big sort of driver for this kind of stuff. And it's basically about, he's written other books, but his main focus is the Indian American sort of diasporic identity formation that happens in the US, especially. But, it translates everywhere. And it's an interesting thing where, like, you have a group of people who move from one place to the other, what they bring with them, how they form their own sort of identities in the US, and how they negotiate ethnicity and culture and tradition in an environment that is already sort of has a history of tense, associations with race and culture and ethnicity and stuff. So finding yourself in that environment and how you relate to sort of Black culture and white culture and Asian culture and Latino culture, and finding being an Indian and all that, you have to confront certain things. And what I realized, what I was confronting was really my own Indianness and how that relates to how Indian I feel in the US and how Indian I feel in India. And a large part of that was because of the kind of music I play and the kind of music I think a lot of people in this chat might play is music that isn't necessarily what we would call like traditional Indian music, or like if you're studying jazz or you're studying sort of Western global music, which is what we hear a lot. It's there's a connotation of a lack of Indianness associated with that. And so how does that, and when you're in India, it's easier to negotiate because you're like, yeah, I'm a jazz musician in India. It's a little bit more clean as a label. But when you when you kind of leave India and you're outside of India and you're still a jazz musician or something, but you're Indian, but you don't play Indian music, but you also don't play like American jazz music. It's that stuff starts to get messy. And I think that sort of was the driver for a lot of these things. Yeah.
I know, and we'll come to that because I heard that spoken quite a bit, specifically in your couple of first episodes that came out on the podcast with different people, and we come to that. So, you said the while I'm assuming obviously these thoughts are something that everybody has at some point. They took shape and form consciously when you sat to write this as an album during the pandemic. So, how long did it take for you to really germinate and for it to finalize as a product?
I started writing in March, and
Hmm.
like I think a week after things locked down, just as a way for me to create a routine for myself. So a lot of it was about just waking up in the morning and having something to do, because for the first like week or two, I was waking up and we just didn't. There was nothing to do, and things were getting canceled as you were waking up, looking at Canada. So it became a way for me to just as catharsis as waking up and having some kind of task. And then so I started writing pretty intensely March to I think like October, November, December. And the record was done in February the next year, March the next year, which was 2021. And it was around mixed by the summer. So it took about a year for everything to be finished, but maybe like 9 months for the project to kind of be completed on my end. Uh,
Hmm.
and I think
But
it's
you got
things.
an opportunity. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just asking, you got the opportunity to record the album in a studio ultimately while the
So we
lockdown
did the
released?
drums in the studios, which was kind of a difficult thing to like logistically figure out. We did it actually probably in hindsight at a time where we shouldn't have done it, but it was December 2020, and it was around when there was like a little bit of a lull in the two peaks, followed by unfortunately another big peak. But like we kind of got in pretty quick, recorded the two drum sets together. Everything else was pretty much remote.
Wow. So everybody did it at their own space.
Yeah, or like one person at my like home studio setup here.
Hmm. All right.
Yeah.
So that's interesting because it's an album which really talks about, it's very personal, I understand. And it came out at a time which was quite a challenging time, and even the things that we take for granted about just being able to rent a studio and have those studio hours and just go about it became something of a luxury, and you had to figure out ways to how to make it work for you in an environment which was kind of a DIY, and figure that out.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So how did the idea of podcast come to you?
So the podcasting idea was uh, I I ended up doing a couple of like remote podcast like things during lockdown. Right after like our India tour, I was doing a couple of things for different people. Like it was kind of like like the Jazz India Circuit podcast asked me to be on their podcast, so I did like an episode for them. And I like the format. Like I hadn't listened to podcasts before at all, really, before I started making my own. So I wasn't a podcast like fan or anything. But I like the idea of like trying to do it. So I tried during lockdown, like in 2020, to do like a song breakdown podcast thing, and like it failed miserably because I hated the sound of my voice and it was awful. Like I tried to do it, I tried to like memorize the script and I kept messing up and I'd keep doing takes and it was so I completely abandoned that and I was like, this is definitely not for me. But then when I started writing the record and it was close to being done, sort of people close to me, like my girlfriend, my brother, all the people who were like in, I was seeing at the time wanted me to like kind of express, like write some of these ideas down or at least express them in a way that was slightly longer form than just like titles in a song or like, just some kind of blurb on my website. They're just about like identity and stuff. And so I started to write, and the writing kind of turned into maybe I'll just like do like a longer form podcast thing. And then that idea of just breaking down songs and slightly talking about themes ended up becoming this like big interview project that ended up happening. But it started out with just like, okay, maybe I should find a way to get this out. And I don't really know how many people are going to listen to it or people are going to really relate to it, but I just needed to kind of like explain what this record is really about, because especially like instrumental music, there's no lyrics, so the only words you have to convey things are like titles. And that gets difficult, and like you don't really get the full story until you do some digging. And so this was kind of like the little digging that I had done for anyone who's interested in listening.
Interesting, because what I found fascinating about your podcast is, and what I do find fascinating because it's still continuing, it was not a one-off thing, and so it quite interestingly had an interplay of your music intertwined in your episodes, and also kind of exploring on the theme which was for your album, and which was then used for the episodes that you interacted and engaged with different people. So when you started with the idea, okay, I want to share a little bit more about the idea, the concept that I was going with and going about it, how did the idea of connecting with who you did ultimately connect and have them share their thoughts come to you? And because I know a lot of people have been engaged in all these episodes at different points of time, and which were global, not just from one. So how did you end up thinking of them and identifying who do you want on your podcast, and how did you go about it?
So the choice to find who I find there was a longer list that I had created, and like some people didn't get back, or there were a few people who were busy and just didn't have the bandwidth to do it. And also, it happened at a time when actually I started asking people when there was like a massive surge in India, and so I asked people in India who I think at the time just it was just too difficult to like jump in and start doing like a
I think I remember you spoke to Adi also about it
yeah,
at
I
one
spoke to
point.
Adi, and like at the time, I think it was just really difficult. So at
Yeah,
that,
my dad was in hospital at that time. I
oh,
remember.
sorry, yeah,
No, no, I know it was a yeah,
yeah,
challenging
it was a
time.
tough
Yes.
time, and like so and I had already interviewed some of the American people, just people who I knew, and so I couldn't push because the interviews were happening. So I had kind of had to go with what I had, but the list was a lot longer. They ended up being pretty big, anyways. It was 17 people, and I kind of created a little bit of like a grid when I was selecting people. So it was people who live outside of India. It was pretty broad. I mean, I don't know if this is the right way to approach it, but it was basically people who live outside of India on one side, people who live in India on the other side, and then it was rows where people who make, let's say, like Western music or Indian traditional music, and on both ends. So I try to interview people who fit all four quadrants. So people who live outside of India who make traditional Indian music, people who live outside India who don't make traditional Indian music, people who live in India who make traditional Indian music, people who live in India who don't make traditional Indian music. And so it's kind of a mix of people who represent what I think is like Indian musicians from different spectrums of different like styles or schools, and obviously all Indian or Indian origin. And it kind of went from there. I wanted it to be a little bit broader too, like, when you do this process, you realize you leave out a lot of perspectives along the way. Like, obviously it was largely in English. So linguistically, we didn't have anybody else from India. And that's a very tiny percentage of what India is. So like that, in that respect, we did not cover by any means what Indian music really like, the breadth of it. Of course, it was a small little like slice of it. And also it was the US, the UK, and India basically. But I really wanted to get like some other diaspora countries like Dubai or Canada, or like even Guyana, Jamaica would have been really cool, like the Caribbeans, Australia. But I didn't really know. I was limited to what the people that I knew, and they were just friends who had reached out to essentially. And so that's kind of what ended up happening with the people that I selected. But it was amazing because whoever I spoke to, you know, it's like podcasting is extremely new to me still. And so the only thing I feel I can really share is what I have learned along the way, which is just the past like couple of months. So at the time I was extremely fresh, so I didn't really know like how it would go. I didn't know how to conduct interviews, any of that stuff. And so luckily the people who I got were extremely like easy to work with and easy to interview, and so that really helped. But that's kind of how I chose people.
I remember you also went a little away from not just the musicians, but you also had, like, for example, Arjun Sagar Gupta was also part of one of your selected people, because um, wherein you just didn't pick just your performers and people who really make music, but also some people who may be in the space of music, but not from a performer point of view, but from the other side point of view. Any specific reason for that?
Yeah, actually, initially I was supposed to have two professors also like that I wanted to approach. So one was Sunil Bhatia, who had mentioned, who wrote this book. Reached out to him. I didn't know him, so like it was kind of a cold email. And then there's another professor who is like a family friend, Sanjay Subramaniam, who I was thinking of reaching out to, but I realized that like part of this making these 3 episodes was me very much stepping away from like what my wheelhouse of expertise is, if I have any expertise. I mean, play the guitar. So outside of playing the guitar and writing music, like talking about these really big ideas and big themes that stray into like um like more academic territory. It was kind of a tough reckoning thing where I was like, okay, I'm not qualified to like speak on these things per se. So I had to really use music as a vehicle to talk about whatever else I wanted to speak about. And obviously in our daily lives we're feeling things and conversing with each other about many different things, but what I really know well is music making and music and how it affects people, and I think how it affects myself. So I use that as a vehicle to do that. So I initially wanted to kind of have a larger frame of reference and have these two like academics kind of speak on certain things. But then I realized it was just, I was getting like, I think, way in over my head at that point, and I had to keep it very like music centric. So Arjun was part of the sort of uh, spectrum of like musician to like maybe like another independent expert, and he was kind of like closer to the musician side but on this line. But then that's where it ended. That's as far as I was comfortable taking it.
Nice. I, a podcast episode can have multiple formats. It can have varied breadth and length of time. You can go into breadth. You can go into one aspect and deeper into it. You can probably have one featured guest on one podcast episode, and you do different things. But you went with a certain style wherein you did not really go with a featured person on one, but you rather went with a theme for each episode and had multiple voices being shared over that, and then
Right.
keeping them relatively crisp in size, not too long, about
Mhm.
20-25 minute long an episode. So these are always the considerations one would go in, especially when you're starting. So for the people who are there in the audience today, who are never explored the idea of a podcast, what would be the essential aspects that you would like to share with them when you go about thinking the design of the podcast, and how, and maybe share your experience of how did you go about it, your process, so that they get just an idea of how did you write your, I mean, went about your styling and designing of the podcast.
Yeah, definitely. So it's if a lot, I would assume a lot of people here, most people here, are musicians familiar with some kind of DAW. For us as musicians, thinking about things that happen over time, whether it's like video production or audio production, is a really easy, and it kind of comes naturally. So like creating like a timeline and adding audio in it and moving audio around, chopping it up, is like second nature to all of us. So the editing part, it's funny, like for musicians, the podcasting part of it is, the story is the harder part. Even though for most podcasters, I think anyone who wants to begin a podcast who's not a musician, the editing and like the tech part of it is the most like daunting part. But for us, that's like where we basically thrive and feel comfortable. So creating like a curated podcast with like 17 interviewees was difficult, and chopping it up and stuff was like a lot of time. It was time consuming, but the mechanics of it were super easy because we just do this all the time. We chop up audio, fly it around, move it around, EQ it, this and that. Like making it sound, I think, good enough was not the difficult part, luckily. The difficult part for me was actually creating like the story and like all the abstractions that come with a podcast that I had never really done before. And so part of it was creating like a set of questions that I had to speak to with the interviewers. That needed to basically be like a way for me to discuss things with kind of, you just like you're doing now, where it's, you have questions, but the essential idea is to get the person speaking and like get the person comfortable in sharing. And especially the topic that I chose was pretty personal anecdotes about their lives and like how they feel about themselves. So pretty like, pretty deep kind of things that maybe are a little tense to talk about on like Zoom. So like the questions had to kind of come in a row. So when it came to creative questions, I had to sort of ease into each question. So it was like, I can actually pull up, if you give me a second, like what the couple of some of the questions were. So they were tailored to some of the people depending on what quadrant they were in. If they were Indians in India playing Western music, quote unquote, then it'd be slightly different. But it was kind of like, what is your name? What music did you grow up listening to? How would you sort of how would you define Indian music in your terms? Would you consider yourself an Indian music? Like, would you consider the music you play Indian music? And it kind of basically grew in like, or went down in like intensity of how deep the questions were getting. So that was one thing that I had to figure out, was like how to actually just phrase these questions. And the other thing related to the question thing was, the big thing, instead of asking like, do you think, because then do you think, etc., because then the answer can just be yes or no, and then there's no more. But it should be like, instead of saying do you think, let's say, jazz in India is considered Indian music, the answer is probably an easy yes or no for some people. So the questions had to become, instead of do you think jazz in India is Indian music, it becomes how do you think the jazz influence in India has affected Indian music as a whole. And so if you change it from a do you question to like a how question, you're getting people to speak more. So that was kind of one thing in the early part of the stage that I had to really sort of figure out and think about, like how to get basically people speaking. The next part of it was constructing the story, which is probably the most difficult thing for me, which was taking up all the audio, putting all the audio together. And by audio, I mean snippets from the interviews. So I chopped up the interviews. I like edited them down. So all the uhs and ums and repeated words and stuff, I would cut out, smash them together, crossfade them, and had these like nice little concise things that I would basically have. Then I would put them in similar themes. So if someone was talking about jazz in India, I would put it together. If someone was talking about Carnatic music, I would put Carnatic music in the US, it would go together. And then within that, you create these like little sub themes within this ginormous timeline that I had on Logic, which was like, like 4 or 5 hours. It was like massive. And from there, you essentially, I carved out episodes. So I started to see bits of fragments of, okay, this could be an episode about what Indian music, like the definition of Indian music. And the second episode could be about how I perceive myself as an Indian person in India and outside of India, and how, what that means to me to be Indian, but also be a musician. and then the third episode was like language. So I could see those kind of trends emerging, and I would chop them up and create these 3 big episodes. And then from there, it was a matter of again doing the distilling process of creating sub themes. So it was a lot of actually just taking audio, moving it around, placing it in different places, and just grouping it thematically. So that took a while because it was 17 interviews. Each interview was like an hour and a half. So it was a lot of audio. But yeah, it's kind of
You
how it.
did these interviews over Zoom with them, or was it
Yeah,
more of,
we use it
okay?
over Zoom. I asked them to, use an external microphone. Again, everyone's a musician, so that ask is super easy. Everyone has an interface. Everyone has a microphone. Again, like unlike other podcasters, like if you listen to podcasts of a similar size that I am at, which is like not a whole lot of listeners. It's not like a massive like This American Life. It's a small, If you listen to other smaller podcasts, the audio qualities and stuff really start to diminish because it's a lot of people who have good ideas, but it's just like they'll turn on their laptop mic and kind of just like speak into a laptop mic. So there's this compression that's happening, and you hear traffic outside, and so yeah. That luckily, as musicians, we are pretty sorted in that front.
That's interesting. And so then you mentioned at some point that you were looking at 3 episodes, is it, to start with? Was that the idea? Then how did that become more like, okay, this will be something I'm probably going to keep continuing and go further. So how did that happen?
Yeah, so that the I did these 3 episodes, and I really liked the process, but it was like way too. It just was really time consuming. But I wanted to kind of, because I had done by the third one, I had kind of gotten a little faster at creating the things, that I wanted to figure out a way where I could kind of keep this going as like a separate outlet, because it felt, even though it is related to my music and my thoughts on music and stuff, it felt like a completely different outlet where I could release new like content, for the lack of a better word, content, like every so often, as I chose. Like if you make a record, you write it for 9 months to a year, 2 years, sometimes more, and then you release it, and then that's it. And then you're just sitting on this 10, 12 track record that you have, and you have to just keep kind of pushing the same thing and finding ways to market it. This felt less like marketing. This was just a product I was creating every week. Instead of musicians, when they create content, it's in service of something else. Like it's like, I'm gonna make Instagram videos so that my Instagram followers grows, so that I can push my music out to more people. So constant content creation feels sometimes like a marketing tool, basically. But podcasting for me now has started to feel like another piece of my like music world that has nothing to do with me playing guitar, which is kind of a nice. It's a little bit of a nice like release for me to get some of those ideas out that I've been thinking about that I don't get a chance to musically. And so that's why I want to continue the format. And so now the idea for me now is to do one episode every 2 weeks, release one episode every 2 weeks. And I've created a little bit of a lead time. So like I released episode 5 today, and I just finished uploading episode 7. So I'm like a 2 episode lead time. And that's, if I can maintain that, then my goal is to do, everybody here can, is witness to me saying this goal out. You can hold me to it. Is one episode every 2 weeks for this year, which is 29 episodes. And if I can do that, then I know that I can kind of make this a thing, which is just a regular thing that I'll do. And so that's the idea. Currently I'm doing song breakdown episodes, and then I'll move on to something else. But yeah, the idea is just to kind of keep it. Uh, Now it has emerged as a channel, kind of like for musicians by musicians. Essentially, that's kind of the podcast thing that I'm working on.
That's very interesting. So, from the theme of uh, exploring the idea of identity in the first 3 episodes to now going more towards song breakdown, I think the last episode that you did was on writing the album during COVID times, I think, and that's when you had people from your band being speaking,
Yeah.
and now you're going more into a song breakdown. Any other theme that you're seeing foreseeing yourself getting into as you move forward?
Yeah, definitely. So I will, that one of the episodes that'll come out in the next few weeks will be the 4th episode of what would have been the identity episodes, which is the future of Indian music. However people define Indian music, how people define future. And so it's kind of just a little bit like a bonus wrap episode. That'll be one of them. And then I want to get into this kind of talking about these larger themes about what we discuss with like our musician friends and stuff, when we just sit around and have dinner or whatever. One of them is what's coming up is what I'm currently working on is how musicians define success, and like this idea of success and making it as a musician, what that looks like, because it's so drastically different for everybody. And it's also kind of, a lot of the goal setting that we read about, like, the grit or deep work or any of these books that are about motivation, goal setting, success and stuff are geared towards more like corporate culture and, people who have like 9 to 5 jobs. But musicians who also have 9 to 5 jobs, but like a lot of musicians kind of define success in different ways. For example, like recognition of your peers goes further than I think anything that I can, tangibly like say. But also financially, there's like all these things, and money isn't your main motivator, but it is, and it is a motivator, but in the right circumstances. So it gets kind of tricky, and so that's what I'm exploring now. I also want to talk about like band leading, but I'm trying to think of like interesting topics that I can speak to other people about, and I want to make that the central focus is to interview people and include that in little snippets like I did with the identity ones. The one thing I'm noticing is and I was talking to uh, friends about this last night, was is this idea of content, what content you consume yourself. So like what you have to really monitor your own content consumption patterns. So if you're thinking about starting like a podcast or anything, even music, I think like this idea of thinking about like I want to make something that I myself would watch or listen to. And I actually am realizing that like now that I've started to do the podcast thing, the podcast that I listen to now, and I listen to a lot of podcasts now because I've like started doing it so I could like learn from them, and now I've just gotten really into like a couple of different shows. But the shows that I like are just people speaking. It's like people speaking for an hour around like a couple of microphones, and it's on in the background like while I'm cooking or doing dishes or whatever, or cleaning or something. Like it's just on there and people are speaking, which is not like what I have made. Mine podcast is way more curated. So I have to really, I think, actually pivot into slightly more of that format, or at least introduce that format. Hopefully, I'll be able to do it. That part scares me a little bit, just like having a candid conversation and then being able to carry it and like, things like that. So that's what I've been thinking about more actually. So yeah, that's one piece of it. I guess like advice that I wish I had kind of gotten early on was like really think about like just the kind of podcast you like and make what you like. And I'm realizing that what I'm making is not exactly what I listen to at a daily basis. So gotta do some tinkering. But yeah, it's a kind of a growth process, I guess.
Interesting, because those are actually going to be the next two things I was going to steer towards, which was one, what are the different podcasts are you listening to, and do you see the format of your podcast changing over time? So you kind of like
Yeah,
went towards that. So
yeah.
maybe you can share a bit about some of the podcasts that you're listening and you really like, and are there any which are not in the space of music? I'd be very curious to know.
Yeah, actually, all the ones that I religiously listen to are not music related. So there's one is like a comedy podcast that I listen to all the time, called Off Menu with James A. Caster and Ed Gamble. These two like comedians from the UK who just like ask people about their dream menu. But it's a really great format because they have essentially the same questions, but for different interviewees, which is a common thing that we see. But their format never changes; just the person changes. And they have because they're comedians, they have the ability to basically riff on anything. And so it's just a funny 1 hour conversation essentially that you're hearing. And they've obviously edited out some of the lulls, like some of the silences in the conversations are edited out, or some of the not funny parts are edited out. But essentially it's like an hour of just speaking. But the other ones that are more curated that I listen to quite a bit, mostly to just kind of transcribe, would be like This American Life was a good one. The Freakonomics Radio is a good one. Um, yeah, those two are the big ones. And then recently I started listening to Questlove, who's the drummer for The Roots. He has a podcast called Questlove Supreme, where again he interviews people for like 45 minutes to an hour. Again, the talked format. But I gravitate more towards the spoken formats. There's another one called Philosophize This, which is a good one too. It's like a philosophy podcast. But the main one of these like Questlove these days is Questlove Supreme, and then this comedy one that I listen to a lot. But yeah.
Anyone from your because I know in the last couple of years, our idea of connecting has changed a lot, and I think that's where the space of podcast also really bloomed. It had been there for a while, but I think it really caught on more so. I feel because the need and the want to connect with people and choosing different media is what really brought it on together. Did you happen to explore some with some musician friends of yours who may be dabbling in that area? Anyone that or maybe someone from India? Did you happen to hear anyone?
Like who are podcasting?
Yeah,
I don't know anybody personally, actually, who is doing podcast episodes. I kind of like I was speaking to. I'm friends with like Adam Neely and Sean
yeah,
from Sungazer are both like content creators on YouTube. So I was talking to them last night about this, and I mean their thing is completely on YouTube, and so it's a
yeah.
totally different format. But yeah, there's a few friends like them, and there's a couple other people I know who are pretty active on YouTube.
Mhm.
I mean, pretty active is like their lives basically. Um, so that was definitely inspired by them. But I also liked the idea of a podcast because it's like there's no screen to see, and obviously like people are listening to podcasts now, like you said, there's definitely this connection to it. There's like a talk radio aspect to it where like you just have it on in the background and it's just there. And so that, yeah, that was a big influence. It's just like the friends that I have who are like creating like storytellers in sort of a new format. Yeah.
So going forward, are you looking at engaging with people whom you may not know so much and getting into
100%.
that discomfort zone?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's definitely what I'm like practicing talking to my friends still. Like I do want to speaking on like the more conversational hour-long conversation based podcasts. I do want to start doing episodes that are kind of like maybe two or three musician friends sitting around like a table and speaking on like topics, and it's like a longer conversation. Um so that I might do, but I very much I think need to start with like my immediate circle so I feel comfortable doing this and then introducing people who I don't know. I don't think I have the skill set yet. Hopefully, I will develop it to like speak to a complete stranger at length and record that. I did read so like the identity podcast. I spoke to quite a few people who I didn't know, like Sarthi Korwar. I didn't know prior to that. Rudresh Mahatpa. I didn't know. I'd heard of them, which made it harder because like I knew their work and stuff. But speaking to them was, and there's a few other people who like I didn't know like super well. So that was a little bit of a challenge, but I mean, because they're such great people, it was fairly easy to do. But yeah, that's the aim, is to kind of expand the circle using, because also the cool thing about being a musician who has a podcast now is that I can speak to musicians who I'm like a fan of, who I wouldn't be able to just approach to play with. Like I couldn't ask like Gilad Hexamon to play with me because he's also a guitar player, and he's incredible. But I can probably ask him to be on a podcast. I haven't asked, so if you know him, you should ask him. But no, just kidding, don't ask him. But something like that, or like if it's like like Rudresh Mahantapa, I haven't played with. I don't think I would play with him anytime soon. We're just kind of in different worlds, but it's easier to approach him for a podcast and be involved in him in that way. So you can kind of like work with your heroes a little bit, even if you're not uh, actively playing with them, which is kind of a cool thing that I hopefully will start to explore a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting because that actually gives you kind of a way to engage with people, not necessarily through your direct art, but in your space of art. So that still is
Yeah.
like in the same landscape of things, which is
Yeah,
interesting.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So coming to back to your album, you also managed to have a tour before you were successful in doing that. Would you like to talk about it? Because I know it was after a long time that you got back to the stage, like anyone did. How was that experience, and did it feel any different from how you have been on the stage before?
Yeah, it felt amazing. If like it was incredible to play and tour. However, I don't know if this is for everybody, but post pandemic there's definitely there's some trepidation about seeing shows, being at shows. There's a little it's what I thought it would be this like explosion of happiness. Would be like, this is incredible, we're back, hurrah. and that's what the summer felt like in New York in 2021. But the fall 2021, it was like people were just a little bit hesitant, and nobody really knew for sure. So that was the setting that we went out on tour. So the tour was amazing. The shows were like well attended. It was great. But we needed to ease back into it. Like the performing part of it was incredible, and some of the shows were like, I think, the best that we've ever played as a band. But everything else around it, which is majority of your time when you're touring, you're only playing for maybe an hour to 2 hours, but the rest of the time you're driving and hauling gear and sleeping late, waking up early, and that whole thing. Those aspects of it were difficult, more difficult this time. Just the logistical, in New York, there's this word called schlep, which is just like schlepping things, which is like lifting heavy things and carrying them in the subway. That aspect of it was difficult. Like we'd forgotten how to just basically just be like, hauling heavy gear into, on no sleep, and, into like a venue and waiting for 7 hours, you're like hungry, but also, it's the whole thing. That part of it, we used to be very easy, was more difficult now. And the same thing, I went on tour again at the end in like mid-December with another band called the New York Chill Harmonic. And it was the same thing where like we had kind of forgotten how to like drive for 7-8 hours a day and just like be ready to perform again. Like that aspect of it actually was a relearning that we had to do, I think, collectively.
Yeah, can imagine. We had a similar thing in India where things really opened up post Diwali for a few months, and really there were a lot of shows happening. But I think there was still a bit of hesitation. There was mixed. There were people who were really excited, and there were people who were really getting out there, and then there were people who were really hesitant, not sure
Yeah.
what to do, how to go about it. And then there's been a lull again, so we are hoping it picks up. How is your year looking like? At least how's you're hoping for it to look like? Let's put it this way.
Yeah,
We
I'm
don't
hoping.
really know
Yeah, we
how
don't
it's going
really
to turn out, but
know.
let's talk about
Yeah.
how you're hoping for it to look like.
So the hope is that I have a pretty busy calendar starting February, and I'm hoping that that remains the case. And so we'll see. We're planning for things to basically just be open and ready to sort of receive us. So we're booking another little like run of shows in April. We're booking hopefully a run of shows in May, and then something in the summer, something in the fall. So like we're starting that process. I think everyone is starting the process. There's definitely a little like hesitancy, you can tell, in booking in venues and booking agents, this and that. It's not like completely like, okay, let's go. So that is contributing some other things where like it just takes longer to book things now for some reason. It takes longer for people to release to get back to you on emails, and for venues to get back to like, you know to us, and so that all those things are adding to a little bit of this like kind of, there's like an impermanence to the whole thing where it could be taken away at any moment. That's still a little bit there. It's less so now, of course, but that's sort of the setting. But yeah, my like in terms of my side musician working calendar, that's pretty full, and so I'm hoping that remains, and I think that will. So we'll see.
That's nice. That's nice. Any new work that you're brewing up on, or you're looking at more taking this music more around the world?
Yeah, I'm thinking of taking this kind of traveling and playing this music as much as I can over the next year to maybe year and a half. I am writing again, but like, not for any particular larger record. I'm just sort of writing to see what next, kind of what sound I do want to kind of get into more. But yeah, the idea is to really kind of play this record as much as I can. Um, uh, because we haven't even played all the songs live. So the idea is to try to get at least all the songs live at some point. And that'll take maybe like a year and a half of shows, I think. And
I
hopefully
really
in
hope you are able to come to
soon.
India. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
I was just gonna say maybe fall of 2022 would see you in India at some point.
yeah, that'd be nice. Yeah, that'd be
Yeah,
amazing.
wonderful. Anybody from the audience would like to ask? I know there are quite a few Shubh Saran fans here. I know for a fact how they were excited when we announced that there's a session with you. So please feel free to either type your question in the chat box, or even better, just speak out and be here. And we'd like to have you, chat with him and share what you would like to know from him. Anyone?
I think we have.
Wait, am I audible?
Yeah. Now
Yes,
you are.
Shivang. Yes, go for it.
Yeah, like I just want to say, like, I have been a huge fan of the podcast since I first heard the since I heard the first episode, and I just like, it's like, okay, so I have been listening to podcasts since 2018, like, quite religiously, and I just love the way that you have edited the podcast. Like, it feels like a documentary, and it feels curated, like it feels different from other podcasts, and I just love that fact about it.
Oh, that's great.
And
That's
yeah,
very.
like, yeah, I also just love the fact that it offers a very deep and a very, like, the stuff that I have heard on your podcast, I haven't even thought about it, or I have never read about it anywhere else. So I just also love that fact about the thing.
Thanks so much. That's very good to hear, especially the curated part, because that's something that I have been thinking about a ton. So thank you. That's awesome. Thanks. What are some of your podcasts you listen to?
Sorry.
What are the podcasts that you listen to? That you
Okay. So, like, there's this. I'm working on a podcast. Okay, I'm not gonna plug myself away. This Made in
Oh,
India, like, one of the podcasts that I listen to. Then there's this another podcast called Beautiful Anonymous by this stand-up guy Chris Gethard.
cool.
Like, the concept of that podcast is, I feel quite unique. He just talks to a random anonymous person through a phone call, and the person, just it's an hour long. The person just tells him about their life, and
Oh,
that's
that's
it.
cool.
So I would say that those are like my top two podcasts.
Nice.
And
Do
of course, off stage being.
Thanks.
So sweet.
Good answer. Good answer.
Thanks, Shivang.
Thanks.
Everyone, you are welcome to even chat with Shubh about his music. You not necessarily have to talk about podcasts. It's all right. You can take this moment to talk about whatever you feel like.
Podcast only.
Yeah, we've done quite a bit of that. So it's all cool. Anyone? Okay, then I guess anything else, Shubh, you'd like to share with everybody before we can then
Uh,
otherwise say goodbye.
no. Is anybody else doing podcasts here? Anybody else looking to do a podcast? Like thinking about it? No. Oh, nice. Okay, cool. We got one person. Nice, great. Well, that's awesome. I mean, I am also like learning the process, very much in the learning stage of doing this currently. So all the best. It's been fun for me. So hopefully it's great for you too.
But how many of you listen to podcasts? At least let's put it this way. If not, you can show virtual show of hand also. Okay, yes, there are quite a few who are raising hands.
Nice.
Okay, okay, okay.
Nice.
So you do hear podcasts. Okay, I know making one can be quite overwhelming and a daunting aspect for
Yeah.
someone, and we totally feel you.
Yeah, it's just really for us as musicians, the challenge is to have the idea basically. So but you have something you want to talk about, you have an idea, then it's fairly easy, smooth sailing, because the tech part of it is easy. I will say, before we close, um, it. I'm lucky that, like, I'm so glad that people are receiving this as content that is curated and that is, like, uh, that is like thought provoking. That's really has been the main aim of this whole thing. For anybody else who's looking to do a podcast or share any of their thoughts, everybody has a unique perspective on anything, or as it is. Like, you don't really, when I say you need an idea, you don't really need like a, you know it's not like a startup where you need like the next great idea. Just your perspective on music and your perspective on things is enough of a unique perspective on things. So, if you are thinking about just expressing yourself non-musically outside of just the music you make, you already have a unique perspective on things, and that, I think, deserves to be told. as a perspective on music. The more voices you have talking about what you do and the art and your expression and like how you perceive the world, those are all stories in themselves, and those are all things I think worth exploring. So yeah, it doesn't it's daunting, but it shouldn't be. It should just be as easy as just your thoughts on things, and everyone has interesting, unique thoughts. So
Yeah, and I'd like to say that, when I don't know how many of you heard that, but Shubh mentioned that when he was writing out to people, there were a couple of cold emails also that he did, and some of them he didn't hear back. So it even happens at this stage of career as well. So don't feel disheartened when you're starting out. That oh my God, because that's something that all of that it happens when you're starting, or especially and you're writing out to people that you may not know, and then you're wondering whether they say don't say, what do they think? Maybe they don't think good of me, and that's why they're not responding. You start overthinking so much and over analyzing those bits. So just
my
go for
my
it.
email inbox is 90% of my email inbox is just messages that I've cold emailed. So yeah, very much so.
So see, but
cold
then
emails
he
I've sent.
receives them and he also sends them. So that's what I'm saying. So it's
Oh no,
both
yeah,
ways.
I meant like 90% of my inbox is me sending, like my sent
Oh,
folder.
so his sent for the equal emails even now.
Oh, yeah. 100%. Oh my God, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. So,
So that should give you confidence, So even if, how long have you been doing this professionally, Shubh, if I may ask?
I guess since maybe 7 years.
Yeah.
Like
So
post college 7 years, but I guess I
post
started.
college, but you started pretty long back, even
Yeah,
while you were here. So
maybe like
it's been a while.
10,
10,
maybe
15,
12,
10,
yeah,
12. Yes, I would
12 years.
say.
Yeah,
Yeah. So it's
yeah.
been a while, and he's been across different parts of the world, staying, living, making it. So yeah, don't get. If you have the idea and you would like to express yourself, you will always find someone who would be there to hear you out. Don't have to look for a million people. That shouldn't be the intent. That will always be daunting
There's
otherwise.
not many people listening to this podcast either. I can assure you. So yeah.
But thank you. I guess if there are no other questions or thoughts coming in, then I guess it's time for me to say thank you to Shubh. Thank you so much, Shubh. It was such a fun to having this conversation. A different
Yeah,
side of conversation. We haven't done kind of that in a while, but really
yeah.
nice to hear how you break down about your thoughts and how you went about doing this. And I hope everybody in the audience enjoyed as much as I did chatting with you. And all the best. Take care. Have a great year, and I really hope that you can come to India this time and we can see you in person and have you back at campus. It's been a while, and love
Yeah,
to have you all over.
I know, that'd be awesome. Yeah, hopefully. And thank you all for joining and raising hands and participating.
Yes. Okay. Have a good evening, everybody in India, and Shubh, you have a good day and take
Thank you.
care, and hope everybody stays safe. Thank
Yeah,
you. Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you, everyone.